I think that storytelling and sharing our stories is so crucial. It is so vulnerable. They are essential for, I believe, creating connection with other people, which furthers our own empowerment and enables us to really, I think, step into our full potentials. It is a life transition moment. Story also breeds community. It brings people together. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Power in the Pause podcast. I am your host, Wendy Paige Sterling, and I am super excited to be here with you guys today because I am joined by my dear, dear new friend, Brad Walsh. Hello, Brad. How are you?
Hello, Wendy. I am so excited, happy, and honored to be here with you. We were talking off before we jumped on, Aaron. I mean, our conversations are always amazing and powerful and beautiful. So I have no doubt this one will be just the same. And I'm really excited to be here and looking forward to it.
Me too. And you guys are going to want to turn off any and all distractions. You are going to want to focus on our episode today because Brad is an expert in our topic today. And we are going to be speaking about the power of story and how each of you gets to find the power of your story. And so let me share a little bit more with you all about Brad and why he is so incredibly qualified and talented to be speaking with us about this today. So I love this fun fact about you. Brad is actually a photographer. He is also a published #1 international best-selling author. He is an international speaker and a podcast host and producer, as well as a story doula who found himself wanting to inspire others during the pandemic. And he birthed the idea of Empowerography, which is a top 2% globally rated podcast. And it is a platform that highlights strong, inspirational, dynamic women who share their stories of success, triumph, resilience, and transformation. And Brad had no idea that when he started this, and, at first it was just this simple concept, but it took on a life of its own. And he is super excited to share his platform with you all and to continue to empower, elevate, and educate by amplifying the voices of women all over the world. And I am so honored, Brad, to know you, to have been introduced to you, to be someone that I call a friend. And I always love our conversations, you guys. Like Brad and I have pretty deep, powerful, honest, vulnerable conversations when we get into a room together. So you are all in for a treat today. And Brad, I know that you have such an interesting background and story, and I'm curious to know how it is that you found your power in not only your story, but in that pandemic pause that enabled you to take this leap.
That took a while. Well, first of all, thank you so much for that beautiful introduction. And again, for having me here. I am so excited to be here and share. So that was a bit of a journey. I mean, I really didn't find my purpose or my calling, whatever you want to call it, till I was 49 years old. And so when the pandemic hit, as you mentioned, I'm a photographer. That's what I leapt from corporate into entrepreneurship as a photographer. I was always doing photography part-time, but I went full force and headfirst into entrepreneurship as a photographer. And of course, when the pandemic hit, I obviously couldn't be booking photo shoots. So I thought, well, I've got two choices here. I can go through door number one, where I sit around and commiserate and complain like over half the world was doing because of what was going on and stay stuck in that. Or I can choose to go through door number two, which was to take advantage of the gift of time that we'd all been given around the world and use it to do something good, to put good out into the world. Because I thought that's what we need more than ever now more than ever is positivity and good to put out into the world. So I call it a dress rehearsal of the podcast in 2019, where I interviewed 8 friends of mine, women who were photographers, makeup artists. And I thought, you know what? Since I can't be shooting, I'm going to reignite the podcast. I might as well do something with my time that I can use and put good out into the world. So I began reaching out to women on Instagram and sharing what my idea was behind the platform, where I wanted to go with it, what I wanted to do with it. And the response was just incredible. women were so happy to hear that a man had created a platform such as this to help elevate women and amplify their voices through sharing their stories, that it turned into this thing where the women I was interviewing were saying, Brad, I've got a friend, I'll connect you. Brad, I know someone, should be a great guest for your podcast. And that's where it all really began, just by taking advantage of that gift, that power in that pause, and sitting and thinking about it. Okay, what can I do here instead of option number one, where I'm sitting around and complaining? That's not going to solve anything. Most of all, it's not going to be good for me. So I took the time to sit and think, okay, well, let's look at things. What options do I have here? And the podcast was the only option I thought that would be good and that would be beneficial to not only me, but to my community, to women around the world. And that's how it all began.
That's so amazing. And it's such a beautiful story. And I kind of want to have you go a little bit deeper into, why women's stories, what really inspired that piece. I know that there's a little bit of the photography piece of, what it is that really lights you up, behind the camera, and what you're able to ignite in the women that you have the privilege of working with. But
Yeah.
I want to invite you to just go a little bit deeper around what it was about focusing on women empowerment that drove you, not just with this podcast, but also with the work that you have done.
Yeah, I mean, the photography is a big part of it, that storytelling piece visually, and then of course with the podcast, audio. But it really started with, I think back to when I was a kid, and my mom left my biological father when I was 10. He was running around on her having an affair. And of course, back in those days, the women stayed home to raise the children while the husband was the one working to support the family, bring in the money. And so when I thought about that and I look back on that as a grown adult male, the fact that my mother, had the strength and the courage and the resilience, and of course the support of my grandmother, her mother, to stand up after 15 years of marriage and say, no more, I don't have to take this anymore. I am taking my boys and we're leaving. That's it, I'm done. And I can't even imagine the fear that she must have felt. I mean, back in this was 1980. She was walking out on a marriage of 15 years. That's all she knew. She got married when she was 18. So to have that courage to do that, that was really a big part of my inspiration. My mother and my grandmother are the foundation for the Empowerography podcast, the photography. My advocacy work for women it really was birthed because of those two women and what I saw them go through and what they dealt with in their lives, and what strong women they are, and how they didn't let the situations they were in stop them from doing what they needed to do or what they wanted to do. And it was not an easy struggle. I mean, my brother and I shared a bedroom, we moved into a 1-bedroom apartment, and that apartment happened to be in my grandparents' building, the same building that my grandparents lived in. And my mom slept on a couch for a couple of years while my brother and I shared the bedroom. And to see her go through that, she got a part-time job. She hadn't worked because she stayed home to raise us. And so for her to actually have to go out to work to get money to support us, of course, we had financial help from my grandparents as well. But to see what she went through and the sacrifices she made for my brother and I in order to give us a life, those two women, they're my heart and my soul. I wouldn't be the man I am today without those two women. They're my everything. They're my inspiration. I mean, my grandmother's passed, but I know she's still here with me always. And so I do this in honor of her, in honor of my mother, in honor of my wife. I have 2 daughters. They're 23 and 25 now. And in honor of them. And then, of course, in honor of all the women around the world, to give them a place to share their stories, because I think stories are important. And, this is one thing I've learned through this podcast is everyone on this planet has a story, and you need to share your story. It's your duty and your responsibility, because you undoubtedly will touch someone else's life through your story. You will give them a permission slip to stand up and share their story. So storytelling is hugely important.
Yeah. And I want to go into this a little bit deeper, because I agree with you. I mean, I think that storytelling and sharing our stories is so crucial. It is so vulnerable, as you well know, right? And they are essential for, I believe, creating connection with other people which
Yes.
furthers our own empowerment and enables us to really, I think, step into our full potential. So why do you believe that? And what are some examples of stories that you have seen come out of people that you have seen tell their story and share it with others?
Well, I mean, you think back thousands of years, women sat around in circles, women's circles, sharing their stories, and it creates a sense of relatability. You can also help someone by sharing your story so that maybe they don't have to go through similar things to what you went through because you've been through it. So you can share how you got through it, which will help other people. It's so important to share our stories. And, like I said, there's a lot of people that believe they don't have a story. And every single person on this planet does have a story. You need to share it, but it creates relatability for people. It's that, as you said, it's that connection. It allows us to connect to other human beings, knowing that, hey, I'm not alone. This person went through something similar to me. Of course, everyone's story is different, but there are similarities there. So it creates that sense of connection because you can relate to them and you have an idea of what they went through. And again, it allows you to not feel alone because when we go through stuff, we think we're the only ones, and we're not. We're not the only ones. Yes, we are the only ones that are going through that uniqueness of our story, but there are people out there who have been through similar things. And when you stand up and share your story, it lets others know that, hey, they've gone through something similar. They pulled through it. So I can reach down within and find the strength and the courage to get through this. They did it, so can I. And that's the most important piece, I think, is the human connection through story, for sure.
I agree. And, I mean, Lord knows I've told many a story of my life. And, my story started about my divorce and it evolved into, by going through that unexpected life transitional moment, it helped me to find my voice, to be able to share my story, to be able to share my journey. And, I think one of the most positive pieces about my story, when I share my story on any and all, stages out there, is really the power that you have to shift somebody's perspective around something that has kept them stuck for so long. And to see how you inspire other people to shift and to do things differently. So what, in your experience, how have you seen those stories?
Oh, man, honestly, these stories have shifted me. In having interviewed over 600 women, I can tell you that I pull inspiration from every single woman that I interview. Her story, I sit and think often actually about some of the stories I've heard, some of the women I've interviewed, and think, how on earth are you even still standing after what you have been through? You are a beacon of hope, a beacon of light. Right. Your story is powerful, Wendy. I've had you on my podcast and I'm blown away by what you have come through and where you are now and how successful you are and how resilient. And that's what it's so incredible to me. I can't even, it's hard to put it into words.
Well, so let me ask you this, because I know that, so many of us get scared to tell our story, right? Like we're like, oh, either you're embarrassed or you're like, oh, nobody gives a shit. Like, who wants to hear my story? Like, I'm just one more person that they have to hear a womp womp story from, right? So what would you say to somebody who's listening right now who is allowing their story to disempower them? Like, what would you say to them to shift out of resistance and to step into the power of what it is that they have to share in this world?
I start out by telling them that their story matters and they matter, and that just relate to them that, by you sharing your story, you can change the trajectory of someone's life. How powerful is that? And I know it's hard to be vulnerable and to open up. And like you said, you have all these things that come through our minds, the imposter syndrome, and who wants to hear my story? I'm a nobody. But nothing could be further from the truth, because we are all individuals. We all have our unique fingerprints, and your story is that. And so by you sharing your story, you can help someone else overcome their journeys, or give them solutions, give them ideas, whatever it is, or give them inspiration. So don't let anyone least of all yourself, hold yourself back from sharing your story. You need to. Your story matters. Your story is important. And you do have a story. You need to, and I would just keep encouraging people, share your story. You have to. Storytelling is so powerful and so important. Again, you can change other people's lives. And really, when you think about it, isn't that part of why we're all here? Is to have impact in this world, to lift each other, to support each other, to cheerlead each other. So by you sharing your story, don't take yourself out of the equation. It's not even about you. It's about your story. It's about your journey and what you can do for another human being by sharing your story. Take yourself out of it completely and be okay. Get okay with the vulnerability, because that's part of it. That's part of sharing our stories, is that vulnerability. And it's okay. Surround yourself with people who will support you and help you to get your story out there into the world.
Yeah. And, it's all your words, so powerful, so important. And I also want to reiterate that, I think sometimes we get afraid that our story is going to define us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
Right. And I can actually relate to that in that, when I was thinking about transitioning over from divorce and pivoting into what it is that I coach on now, which is really around helping women to learn how to trust themselves unapologetically. And I do that through teaching them how to tap into their intuition. I mean, it was probably, 6.5 years. Here I am talking about my divorce. And I felt like it was starting to define me. Not in a bad way, but more of but there's so much more to my story. And I believe that we all get to start with the story that really was the shifter for us, right?
Yeah.
That it's almost like I can sit here and say okay, yes, I talk about my divorce story. I talk about how it woke me up. I talk about how it enabled me to trust myself again and to really realize the power of my intuition. And that story then opened me up to see so many other instances in my life where I downplayed trusting myself, where I stopped listening to my intuition, right? So it's I also feel like you don't realize that the story that you think you're afraid to share is just a snippet of even the bigger picture. And so if you are somebody who's thinking that maybe, oh, I don't know that I want to be defined as the divorcee coach, right? That was a moment in time. That was a blip on the screen. It was my transition that woke me up. So
that's your baseline or your foundation for your story. You can't discount that piece of the story. That's part of you.
No.
Your story is part of who you are. And Wendy, you have evolved into a completely different woman. So you have to share that piece of it, because that's part of your evolution.
Right. And it's not I don't expect only people who've been through divorce or thinking about divorce to relate to my story, right?
Right.
It is a life transition moment. They always say in the world of business, right? There's riches in the niches, right?
Yeah.
But it's your story it's the opposite of that, right? It's what is meant to actually bring your people in. You talk a lot about how story also breeds community, right? It brings people together. It starts conversations that wouldn't normally happen. So how have you seen story sharing, storytelling create community? Because I know you've created your own. That's a beautiful place. What do you observe in that?
Vulnerability. People are starting, when one person shares, it allows others. It gives those the permission to do that, and seeing how stories can heal people, sharing, being that vulnerable. Yes, it takes a lot. You have to dig deep to get vulnerable, and you have to be willing to share. And listen, you don't have to share every single detail of your story. You can choose which parts you want to share and be vulnerable with those parts. You don't have to share every single detail, but it's just seeing that connection. I've seen it in my community when I've posted questions or I've shared something personal to me. And that's what it is. It's that people resonating and relating to what I've shared. They can see themselves in a piece of my story that I've shared. And I think that when we do that, you help other people. That's what we're all here for. So seeing that in my community, I published my 500th episode, and my 500th episode was all about me and my journey and my story. And I had people reaching out saying, "Thank you for sharing that. I didn't know that about you," because I shared things that I haven't shared with everyone in that episode that people wouldn't have known. So, like I said, be selective about what you want to share. If there's some piece of your story that you don't want to share, you don't have to. You are the author of your story. You are the author of your own book. So you be selective about what you want to share with the audience, but just know that your story can inspire others. And that's what it's all about, is inspiring each other and helping each other. But that's where I've seen it, is when I've shared my most vulnerable moments, is that people reach out and say, "Thank you for sharing that," or "I didn't know that about you," or "I can relate to this part of your story." That's what it's about.
Yeah. And you're bringing up something that had come up for me as I was thinking about what I wanted us to talk about today. And it has a lot to do with listening when you are storytelling. And when I say listening, what I mean by that is really tapping into like a lot of your senses, not just necessarily your hearing, let's say, right?
Yeah.
So, and I've talked about this in the place of like, so many times when we're in a conversation with someone, we're always like, we're not listening when we're engaging in a conversation with people, because it's like something will come up and you're like, "Oh, I want to say something about that."
Yes.
And then you stop listening, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes even in storytelling, right? Like sometimes you may interrupt somebody in the middle of something, or, and so I'm curious to know, like, how do you see listening play a role in storytelling?
Listening is one of the most important aspects. Next to the story, I think listening is the second most important thing. Conversation is the catalyst for change. I did a poll once in my Facebook community, and I asked people, the question was, "Do you think you're a good listener?" And I knew before I even posted that question,
Yes, I am.
90%, 90% of the people are going to say, "Yes, I am." And it's not true. It really isn't. Listening, like actually listening with intent, is a skill set. And as a podcast host, that you have to be able to listen. I've had people reach out to me that I've had on the show. There was one woman, she reached out and she said, "I was listening to our episode in the car with my daughter, and my daughter's referenced a couple of points where you went back in the interview and brought up points that were mentioned earlier on in the interview." And she said, "You are a really good listener." And that's what the key is listening. We're so busy, as you said, listening to respond.
Yeah.
We're thinking about what we're going to say next.
Get out of my head, Brad. It was like, yes.
That's what most people do, is they listen just to respond. But you have to listen. We have to go into conversations, whether it be an interview, storytelling, with an open mind, open ears, and an open heart to hear. Be curious. Don't you want to know what this person thinks? You're engaging in a conversation with them for a reason. Listen to what they have to say to you. You could walk away from that conversation with a completely different viewpoint. And that's not to say we go into conversations to change the person's mind, because that's not what it's about. It's about to listen, to learn and educate ourselves, and be curious. Hear what the other person's point of view is.
Right.
It could completely change your viewpoint on something, or it could give you a completely new perspective on something. So listening, I think, is the second most important piece.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And, you hit the nail on the head, because something that I talk about quite a bit is, so many times we listen so that we can like interject. And what ends up happening is you stop listening in those moments, right?
Yep.
And you don't even hear probably the good stuff that's coming.
Because you're stuck here.
Right. And you're so stuck on, but wait, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that we've almost we want so badly to share and relate, right? Which storytelling does, but your story also needs that room to breathe. It needs the space for you to it's almost like, I don't know why this reference is coming in for me right now, but it's almost like, you're listening to a classical piece, let's just say, right? And someone's playing the piano and the piano stops and you're ready to applaud, but it's just a little pause of a break before they get into like some crescendo or something, right? And I think that it goes back to our theme today around, these moments of pause that sometimes can feel uncomfortable. But I will also tell you that I know as a public speaker and as somebody who's been on podcasts and in the media, pauses when you are telling your story are so important, and they are not meant to be filled, right?
People are uncomfortable with silence. That's the problem. They don't like
Right.
silence. And there's so much as the power is in the pause, truly, because that draws your audience in when you pause for a minute.
Yes.
And just let the silence be there, as uncomfortable as it may be for people. Just revel in that. It is truly so powerful.
Right. Like, how many times have you been in a conversation with someone, even if they're like just sharing a story about an experience that they had on vacation or whatever it is, not necessarily like this groundbreaking life transition story, but how many times you're just like, you kind of have nothing to say at the end of their story, and you like are grasping at straws of like trying to figure out like, and it is these, I feel like there's such a need in us to feel like we have to show up a certain way. And what I think storytelling does is it really allows us to just show up as we are.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
to take away the bells and whistles and the pomp and the circumstance, and just to, coming back full circle to some of what you were talking about earlier, it's like stories make us relatable. Stories are what connect us to one another, right? Like, Brad, your story, I wasn't raised by a single mom, but I was raised by immigrants who had nothing when they came to this country. And so I know what it is like to grow up in a home where there's a lot of sacrifice, right?
Yeah.
And so while I may not be able to relate to you, like I could sit here and cut you off and be like, oh, well, that's not my story. I wasn't raised by a single mom. Like, I'm checked out, I'm done.
Yeah.
It's like, no, I'm going to listen because I want to hear about Brad's experience. I want to hear about how he learned XYZ from his mother and his grandmother. Because what I learned from my mother and my grandmother, right? The power of resilience, the power of working hard, the power of saving, really, where our focus was in our family around that. Like, and so it's like, I want to, you guys, I would invite you to listen with a lens of curiosity when people are sharing and telling story, because whatever that thought is that is interrupting your experience of the other person is probably not going to be relevant by the time that person ends their sentence or their paragraph.
Yeah, as you said, our stories are different, but there are similarities there. So it creates that relatability. And you want to hear what I went through, and I want to hear what you went through and see where the similarities lie and how our situations differed. But there are similarities there. So listen, like a friend of mine always says, we have two ears and one mouth for a reason. Use these instead of this all the time. Listen to what people have to say.
So true, Brad.
Because you can learn a lot.
You learn more by listening.
Yes, absolutely.
I'm telling you, if there's anything I have learned over the last decade of my life, it is the power of listening. And there is so much more to be learned in the silence than there is with your actual words.
Well, I mean, there are awkward silences, like that are awkward, not power in the pause, but awkward silences. And that's something completely different than what we're talking about. There is a lot of power in that pause. And again, it brings that person or your audience, whatever it is, if you're on a stage speaking, it brings your audience in. You can almost see them leaning in. Yes. And how much power that is that you have in your hand to bring the audience in that way and then to continue on in your story. It's everything.
It really is. Brad, I love you so much. And I
love you too.
Adore you so much. You guys, I'm going to drop it now at the end of the episode. Brad is my first male guest on this podcast, which is such an honor. And honestly, there is no other person that I would want to fill this than you, Brad. Like, I love you so much. And I love the work that you do both in front of and behind cameras. You just have a way. And really, I want to make sure that everybody is able to find you, connect with you, and engage with you. So where are the best places that people can do that?
Well, I want to first say I am so honored to be the very first male guest on your podcast. That is beyond honored for me, honestly, to have been asked to be part of your platform as a man and sharing my story and my journey. So thank you so much for the incredible honor and opportunity to be here and to be in your space. And I love
You're
you too.
welcome.
You're an amazing. The first time we connected, I knew there's just that this is a very special connection. You are an incredibly special person. And
Thank you.
I see us as friends for life. That you meet those people in your life and there's just that click. You are one of those people. And I am so grateful that we got connected. And
Me
I'm
too.
grateful to call you a friend.
Me
Okay.
too.
So people can find me at my website, www.empowerographypodcast.com. You can listen to the podcast, Empowerography, on Apple, Spotify, wherever you wish. Instagram, you can find me at Empowerography Podcast. If you want to check out my photography work, you can find me on Instagram as well at VisUphoria_photography. That's VISUPHORIA_photography. You can find me on Facebook. I'm always open to connect and chat, and I'm always looking for guests for the podcast. So just reach out and I'm happy to have a conversation.
Amazing. Brad, thank you so much for being here. And you guys, thank you all so much for tuning in. As a reminder, do not forget to hit subscribe so that you do not miss a single episode, because I release one every single week. And especially if you love today's conversation, hit that 5-star rating so that more people can find this podcast, and follow me across social media at Wendy Paige Sterling. I hope that you guys have a beautiful rest of your day. With every single one of my podcast episodes, my goal is to help each and every one of you to find your own power in your pause. And hopefully today's episode inspired you to find your story in the pause. Sending you all so much love and light always. Mwah. Bye, everybody.